World War II is remembered for atomic bombs and legendary tanks. But behind the history books, there was a parallel universe of secret projects that sound like drunk brainstorming sessions. Militaries tried exploding bats, flying jeeps, pigeon-guided missiles, and tanks that overheated just by existing. This video is about 44 real top-secret weapons that promised victory and delivered embarrassment instead. 1. While the Manhattan Project was busy splitting atoms with top-tier science, the U.S. Air Force was actually listening to a Pennsylvania dentist who suggested that strapping napalm to Mexican free-tailed bats was a winning strategy. The logic of Project X-Ray was that these bats would roost in the wooden eaves of Japanese cities and burn them down simultaneously, but the execution was a complete disaster. During a test run in New Mexico, the bats were accidentally released from their hibernation freezers early, and instead of acting like soldiers, they did exactly what confused flying rodents do. They swarmed the base and incinerated the entire Carlsbad Army airfield, including a general's personal car, proving the weapon worked perfectly against the wrong side. 2. You have to admire the British Department of Miscellaneous Weapon Development for creating the Panjandrum, a device that looked less like a weapon and more like a rocket-propelled death wheel from a steampunk nightmare. It was essentially two massive steel wheels connected by a drum of explosives, designed to crash into Hitler's Atlantic Wall. But the rockets attached to the rim rarely fired in sync. This turned the 10-foot beast into a chaotic, spinning firework that ignored all steering attempts and famously chased a group of terrified admirals and a dog down a beach during a top-secret inspection. It eventually crashed into the sea and exploded, leaving the top brass of the Royal Navy wiping sand off their uniforms and questioning their life choices. 3. German engineering is usually synonymous with precision, but the U-1206 submarine sank because the captain did not know how to flush the toilet. This advanced U-boat featured a high-pressure toilet that allowed the crew to use the facilities while submerged deep underwater, but it was so complicated that it required a specialist technician to operate a series of valves. When the captain tried to flush it himself and failed, he opened the wrong valve, causing high-pressure seawater to flood the submarine's batteries. This created chlorine gas, forcing the submarine to surface immediately right in front of British patrols, proving that a complicated bathroom can be more dangerous than depth charges. 4. New Zealand faced the threat of invasion with limited resources, so the Minister of Works decided to build a tank out of a farm tractor and some roofing iron. The resulting Bob Semple tank is widely considered the worst armored vehicle ever created, looking more like a corrugated metal shed on tracks than a weapon of war. It was so top-heavy and unstable that the gunners had to stop the vehicle to fire, and the vibrations were so intense they often jammed the machine guns. The armor was barely bulletproof, and the whole contraption had to stop completely just to change gears, making it a slow, noisy target that was fortunately retired before it could embarrass anyone on an actual battlefield. 5. We often hear about space lasers in science fiction, but the Nazis actually drew up plans for a giant orbital mirror called the sun gun. The concept involved launching a massive reflector into space to focus the sun's rays onto enemy cities, burning them to a crisp like an ant under a magnifying glass. The scientists calculated it would take about 50 to 100 years to build, completely ignoring the fact that they did not even have a rocket capable of reaching orbit yet. It remains one of the most ambitious and delusional villain plots in history, proving that their engineering reach far exceeded their grasp of reality. 6. Psychological warfare is usually about fear, but the American OSS decided the best way to break Japanese morale was to weaponize the smell of a dirty diaper with a spray called Who Me. The plan was for resistance fighters to sneak up on Japanese officers and spray their backsides with a chemical concoction that smelled like pure fecal matter to humiliate them in front of their troops. Unfortunately, the inventors forgot that wind exists, and the substance was so volatile that the person spraying it almost always ended up smelling just as repulsive as the victim. The project was scrapped after they realized that nobody wants to take orders from a resistance fighter who smells like a walking sewer. 7. While other nations were building aircraft carriers out of steel, the British entertained the idea of building a 2-million-ton island out of ice and wood pulp. Project Habakkuk was a plan to create a floating fortress made of pykrete, a frozen mixture of water and sawdust that was supposedly indestructible and took months to melt. The absurdity peaked during a secret meeting when Lord Mountbatten fired a pistol at a block of this super ice to prove its strength to the Allied command. The bullet ricocheted off the frozen block and whizzed around the room, nearly hitting an American admiral and proving that while the ice was indeed strong, the idea was perhaps too dangerous for the people in the boardroom. 8. You might think guided missiles require advanced microchips, but the US military decided the best guidance system was actually 3 pigeons pecking at a screen. Project Pigeon was the brainchild of behaviorist B.F. Skinner, who trained actual birds to recognize enemy ships and peck at them to steer the missile. The pigeons were placed inside the nose cone with tiny electrodes on their beaks, creating an organic autopilot that was surprisingly accurate in simulations. Despite the brilliance of the idea, the project was cancelled because no general could keep a straight face while listening to a proposal about a kamikaze weapon piloted by farm poultry. 9. The British Army developed a machine called the Praying Mantis, which was essentially a tank designed to shoot over walls without exposing itself. It featured a machine gun turret mounted on a long hydraulic arm that could lift up and down, making the vehicle look like a robotic insect. While the concept was sound, the reality was nauseating because the movement of the lifting arm caused the crew inside to suffer from severe motion sickness, even on flat ground. The swaying was so bad that the gunners could barely aim, and the project was abandoned because a tank is useless if the crew is too busy vomiting to fight. 10. Nazi Germany is often credited with engineering marvels, but the Krumlov proves they were also taking design tips from Looney Tunes cartoons because they literally just bent a rifle barrel to shoot around corners. Designed for the STG-44 assault rifle, this attachment came with a 30 or 90-degree curve and a periscope, theoretically allowing soldiers to fire without exposing their heads. The problem was that high-velocity bullets tend to shatter when you force them to make a hard left turn at supersonic speeds. The friction was so intense that the bullets would fragment into an unpredictable shotgun spray, and the barrels themselves would wear out or explode after just a few hundred rounds. 11. While scientists in New Zealand were busy experimenting with what became known as the tsunami bomb, they discovered that recreating Mother Nature's rage is a little more complicated than lining up explosives and hoping for a cinematic wave. Project SEAL involved thousands of controlled underwater detonations, and the math suggested that in theory, a massive, perfectly timed chain of blasts might generate a destructive surge. The problem was that in theory was doing all the heavy lifting because they never proved it on a full operational scale. By the time serious resources would have been required, the war had shifted priorities, and the idea faded into classified obscurity as a fascinating but wildly impractical attempt to weaponize the ocean itself. 12. If you thought the mouse tank was ridiculous, then the German Landkreuzer P. Hausenratte was purely delusional. It was a design for a land battleship that would have weighed 1,000 tons, which is roughly the same as an entire naval destroyer parked in a wheat field. The plans called for it to be armed with actual naval artillery guns taken from warships, making it less of a tank and more of a moving fortress that would have crushed any road, bridge, or pipe it tried to cross. It was eventually cancelled because someone finally realized that building a tank the size of a cathedral was a terrible use of steel when you are losing a war. 13. Military jeeps are great for driving on rough terrain, but for some reason, the British decided what a jeep really needed was a rotor and a tail fin. The Hafner Rotabuggy was an attempt to create a flying jeep that could be towed behind a plane and then glide down to the battlefield like a helicopter. During tests, the vehicle shook so violently that the pilot had to wrestle with the control column just to keep it from flipping over in midair. It looked absolutely ridiculous dangling from a bomber, and the test pilots described the experience as terrifying, proving that just because you can make a car fly does not mean you should ever actually do it. 14. The Japanese military attempted to attack the American mainland with Fugo balloon bombs, which sounds like something invented during a bored late-night strategy session, but was a real intercontinental weapon. Thousands of hydrogen-filled paper balloons carrying incendiary and anti-personnel devices were released to ride the high-altitude jet stream across the Pacific. Most simply plunged into the ocean or drifted into uninhabited wilderness. And while a small number did reach North America and caused tragic casualties, the campaign achieved virtually no strategic impact. In military terms, it was an enormous logistical gamble that delivered almost nothing measurable beyond confusion, scattered fires, and the realization that hoping the wind wins your war is not exactly a master plan. 15. Porsche is famous for fast sports cars, but during the war, Ferdinand Porsche designed a tank so heavy it literally sank into the ground. The Maus weighed 188 tons, which is about the same as 30 elephants taped together. It was so massive that no bridge in Europe could support it, meaning it had to drive underwater with a snorkel to cross rivers. Ultimately, it was a slow, fuel-guzzling steel bunker that destroyed roads just by driving on them, proving that bigger is definitely not always better in engineering. 16. Nazi engineers developed the wind cannon, which might be the most over-engineered way to weaponize a gust of air in human history. The concept was to fire a concentrated blast of compressed air and vapor toward enemy aircraft, theoretically destabilizing them through intense turbulence. In controlled tests, the device could smash thick wooden boards at a couple hundred meters, which sounds impressive until you remember that combat aircraft are not made from garden fencing and tend to move very quickly. Accurately aiming a traveling shockwave at a fast-moving plane proved nearly impossible, and real-world results were deeply underwhelming. The giant cannon ended up demonstrating that physics does not care how dramatic your blueprint looks on paper. 17. The Royal Navy developed a rocket weapon called the unrotated projectile to defend ships from aircraft, but it was arguably more dangerous to the ship than the enemy. The device fired a rocket that dragged a long wire with a mine attached to the end, intending to snag an enemy plane's wing and pull the mine into it. However, the wind is a fickle mistress, and if the rocket did not hit anything, the mine would deploy a parachute and slowly drift back down. Unfortunately, the wind often blew these live mines directly back onto the deck of the British ship that fired them, causing sailors to scramble for cover from their own anti-aircraft fire. 18. The British Home Guard was desperate for anti-tank weapons, so they invented a glass flask covered in superglue and a wool sock inside a metal casing. The sticky bomb was designed to shatter and adhere to enemy armor, but in practice, the glue was indiscriminate and preferred to stick to the person throwing it. Soldiers were terrified that if they pulled the pin and tried to throw it, the bomb would simply remain glued to their hand or uniform like a clingy pet. It was so dangerous to the user that even the Prime Minister marked the file with a note saying, "Do not use this unless absolutely necessary." 19. Remote-controlled cars are fun toys, but German engineers tried to turn them into a serious weapon called the Goliath. This tiny tracked vehicle carried explosives and was steered by a remarkably long control wire connected to a joystick. While it looked futuristic on paper, in reality, it was slow, loud, and incredibly clumsy over rough terrain. Allied soldiers quickly realized they didn't need to waste heavy ammo on it, because they could simply cut the control wire with a shovel or just step out of the way, turning the terrifying robot bomb into an expensive paperweight. 20. At some point, someone looked at a standard tank and decided that tracks were simply not weird enough, leading to the proposal of the screw tank, a vehicle propelled by two enormous rotating corkscrews instead of wheels or treads. The theory was that the spirals would chew through snow, swamp, and mud where conventional vehicles bogged down, and in limited concept demonstrations the idea showed promise in extremely soft terrain. Unfortunately, the moment the machine encountered firm ground, pavement, or uneven surfaces, steering became unpredictable and traction vanished, causing the vehicle to slide awkwardly or spin sideways like a confused carnival ride. The concept never matured into a practical battlefield solution, remaining more of a fascinating mechanical experiment than a serious weapon of war. 21. The Smith gun looks less like a piece of artillery and more like a tactical baby carriage designed for a giant. Invented by a retired army major for the British Home Guard, it rolled on two large pram wheels that gave it a comical appearance. To actually fire the weapon, the crew had to physically tip the entire gun onto its side, using one of the wheels as a base plate. It was heavy, awkward, and had a nasty habit of cracking its own axle when fired, making it a weapon that was arguably safer to stand in front of than behind. 22. German engineers developed the Kugelpanzer, which translates literally to ball tank, and it remains one of the biggest mysteries of the war. It looks like a giant rolling alarm clock with a viewing slit and a small engine on the back. Only one survives in a museum today, and nobody knows exactly what it was for, but the best guess is that it was a reconnaissance vehicle. It implies that someone thought the best way to spy on the enemy was to roll towards them in a loud spherical metal tumbleweed that offered zero stealth and no firepower. 23. Aviation physics suggests that tanks are not meant to fly, but Soviet engineers ignored gravity and strapped huge biplane wings to a T-60 tank anyway. The Antonov A-40 was intended to glide onto the battlefield, drop its wings, and start fighting immediately. However, during the only test flight, the tank created so much drag that the towing bomber engines nearly overheated and exploded. The pilot had to detach the tank early just to save his own plane, proving that heavy armor and gliders are two concepts that should legally remain divorced in the world of aerodynamics. 24. The British military establishment was usually conservative, but Winston Churchill had a strange obsession with a trench-digging machine called Cultivator No. 6. The idea was to build a massive 100-ton vehicle that could burrow through the earth like a mechanical mole to create instant trenches for soldiers to advance safely. The problem was that the machine was designed for the static warfare of the previous global conflict, completely ignoring the fact that modern war was fought with fast tanks and aircraft. It was essentially a very expensive way to ruin a perfectly good garden, as by the time they built it, the war had already moved on. 25. Desperate times call for desperate measures, but the German Natter rocket plane was basically a manned missile made of plywood and glue. It was designed to launch vertically from a tower like a firework, climb at breakneck speed to intercept bombers, and then fire a salvo of rockets before the pilot bailed out. The engineering was so crude that the pilot was essentially strapped to a volatile rocket engine with no landing gear. The launch force alone was enough to knock the pilot unconscious, and the idea of asking a human to steer a wooden lightning bolt proved that the Luftwaffe had completely run out of good ideas and was just throwing furniture at the enemy. 26. While most air forces were trying to make their planes faster and sleeker, the Soviet Union decided to turn a bomber into a flying shotgun with the Fire Hedgehog. They took a Tu-2 bomber and fitted the bomb bay with 88 submachine guns pointing downward, all rigged to fire simultaneously. The concept was to fly over enemy trenches and unleash a torrential rain of lead that would suppress anyone on the ground. However, the logistics of reloading 88 individual guns were a nightmare, and the recoil from firing them all at once put immense structural stress on the airframe, creating a weapon that looked terrifying on paper but was completely impractical to maintain in a real war zone. 27. German engineers were obsessed with vengeance weapons, and the V3 cannon was their attempt to build a gun so big it could shoot London from across the English Channel. Unlike a normal cannon, this one had multiple propellant chambers along the barrel that were supposed to fire in sequence to accelerate the shell to hypersonic speeds. The problem was that getting the timing right for the explosions was nearly impossible with 1940s technology. The gun would frequently misfire or blow itself up during testing, turning the weapon into a giant, stationary pipe bomb that was more dangerous to the firing crew than the target. 28. Most aircraft designers agree that engines should not catch fire, but the Heinkel 177 bomber seemed designed to do exactly that. The German Air Force demanded a heavy bomber that could also dive, which is aerodynamic nonsense, so engineers coupled two engines together to turn a single propeller on each wing. This generated so much heat that the oil would boil, and the engines would frequently burst into flames during normal flight, earning the plane the nickname of the Flaming Coffin. Crews hated it because they spent more time fighting their own aircraft than the enemy, and it stands as a monument to what happens when political demands override the basic laws of thermodynamics. 29. Vertical takeoff is a difficult concept even today, but the Focke-Wulf Triebflügel tried to achieve it by turning the entire plane into a giant blender. This ramjet fighter had no wings, but instead used 3 massive rotor blades spinning around the fuselage to lift off, meaning the pilot was sitting inside the hub of a giant propeller. The most terrifying part was the landing procedure, which required the pilot to back the aircraft down onto its tail while looking over his shoulder, all while the spinning blades blurred his vision. It was a design that seemed intent on making the pilot dizzy before killing him, and fortunately for everyone involved, it never left the drawing board to test its theory of rotary insanity. 30. There is overcompensating, and then there is the Schwerer Gustav, a railway gun so comically large that it required its own personal railway tracks to move anywhere. Weighing in at a staggering 1,350 tons, this steel behemoth fired shells the size of small cars and required a crew of thousands just to assemble and aim it over several weeks. While it could theoretically destroy any fortification on Earth, it was practically useless because the moment you started setting it up, every Allied pilot in the hemisphere could see it from space. It fired only 48 shots in combat before the Germans realized that a weapon that cannot move or hide is just a very expensive target. 31. Rocket science was in its infancy during the war, and the Messerschmitt 163 Comet proves that maybe we should have kept the training wheels on a little longer. This tiny interceptor was the only operational rocket-powered fighter of the war, capable of incredible speeds that allowed it to zoom past bombers before the pilot could even aim his guns. The catch was that it carried highly volatile fuel that would explode if the 2 separate liquids even touched each other, and instead of landing gear, it used a metal skid that often caused the plane to bounce and flip upon landing. It was a plane that was statistically more likely to kill its own pilot during takeoff or landing than it was to shoot down an enemy. 32. When the British Navy ran out of actual anti-aircraft guns, they decided to issue ships with the Holman projector, which was essentially a steam-powered potato cannon. It used a simple pneumatic system connected to the ship's boiler to launch grenades at low-flying aircraft, but the pressure was often too low to do any damage. The sailors quickly realized the weapon was a joke and discovered that it was much better suited for launching empty beer bottles or potatoes at passing seagulls for entertainment. It holds the dubious distinction of being the only weapon in naval history that was more effective at providing recreational skeet shooting for bored sailors than defending the fleet from the Luftwaffe. 33. Multitasking is hard for anyone, but Soviet engineers thought a tank commander could handle 5 different turrets shooting in 5 different directions at the same time. The T-35 was a land battleship that looked impressive in parades, but was an absolute nightmare in reality, requiring a crew of 11 people who could rarely hear each other over the engine noise. The commander had to coordinate fire from the main gun and multiple machine gun turrets, resulting in a chaotic mess where the tank usually ended up shooting at nothing in particular. It was so heavy and long that it frequently got stuck in ditches or broke its own transmission, proving that 5 guns are definitely not better than 1 if nobody knows what they are aiming at. 34. In the Panic of 1940, the British, desperate for armored vehicles, created the standard beaverette, which sounds like a small rodent, but was actually a car covered in oak planks and steel. It was widely known as a mobile armchair because it was open-topped, and the armor was so heavy on the front that the car became impossible to steer effectively. The rear of the vehicle was often just unprotected wood, meaning that the driver had to face the enemy at all times because retreating would expose the flammable back end to gunfire. It was a vehicle that offered the protection of a garden shed and the handling of a shopping cart, yet men were expected to drive it into battle. 35. The Allies attempted to solve the problem of amphibious landings with the duplex-drive Sherman, a tank fitted with a collapsible canvas flotation screen and small propellers so it could literally swim to shore. In controlled trials on calm water, the system functioned as intended, allowing the heavy vehicle to float just long enough to reach land. However, real ocean conditions are far less cooperative than demonstration lakes, and during the Normandy landings, several units were launched too far offshore in rough seas. Many of the tanks flooded and sank before ever firing a shot, while others that were deployed closer to land performed far better. It became a sobering lesson that when your armored assault depends on fabric walls and cooperative waves, small miscalculations can become very large problems. 36. The Blacker Bombard sounds like a medieval siege weapon, and honestly, it was about as technologically advanced as one. It was a spigot mortar used by the British Home Guard that fired a 20-pound anti-tank bomb, but instead of a tripod, it was often mounted on a permanent concrete pillar in the middle of a road intersection. This meant the weapon could not be moved or hidden, so the crew had to stand in the open next to a giant concrete signpost that screamed, "Shoot me to any approaching tank." The fuse was also notoriously unreliable, meaning the bomb would often bounce off the enemy tank without exploding, leaving the crew staring awkwardly at an angry Panzer from their fixed concrete position. 37. Italian aviation is famous for style, but the Caproni Campini N1 was a jet plane that forgot how to be a jet. It used a standard piston engine to drive a compressor, which then mixed air with fuel to create thrust, a design that combined all the complexity of a jet with the slowness of a propeller plane. It was loud, burned fuel at an alarming rate, and was actually slower than the biplanes it was supposed to replace. The test pilots noted that while it technically did not have a propeller on the outside, it offered absolutely no advantage over existing technology, making it a very expensive and noisy way to fly slowly across the Italian countryside while looking futuristic. 38. Fighter planes are generally designed to shoot at things in front of them, but the British Bolt & Paul Defiant decided to be different by having absolutely no forward-firing guns. Instead, all the firepower was concentrated in a heavy turret behind the pilot, meaning the aircraft could only attack if the enemy politely flew alongside it. This tactical genius required the pilot to fly parallel to German bombers while the gunner tried to aim, which is the aerial equivalent of a drive-by shooting in a slow car. German pilots quickly realized that if they just attacked from the front or below, the Defiant was completely defenseless, turning this heavy fighter into a sitting duck that was eventually relegated to night duties. 39. If you ever looked at a tank and thought it needed to be longer than a city bus, you would love the British TOG 2. Designed by the same committee that built the tanks for the First World War, it was a massive 80-ton relic intended to cross muddy trenches that no longer existed in modern warfare. It was so long and heavy that it moved at a top speed of 8 miles per hour, which meant infantry could literally walk faster than their armored support. The tank looked like a giant steel baguette on tracks and was completely obsolete before it was even finished, proving that nostalgia is a terrible basis for engineering military vehicles in a fast-paced war. 40. The British Covenanter tank was a masterclass in how not to design a cooling system, because for some reason, the engineers put the radiator at the front and the engine at the back. This meant that boiling hot pipes had to run through the entire fighting compartment right next to the driver, effectively turning the inside of the tank into a mobile sauna. Drivers would frequently pass out from heat exhaustion, even in cold weather, and the cooling system was so inefficient that the tank would overheat just by idling. It was the only tank in the war that was more likely to defeat its own crew with heat stroke than the enemy, and it was wisely kept in Britain for training purposes only. 41. Symmetry is usually a good thing in aircraft design, but the German Blohm & Voss BV-141 looked like it was assembled in the dark from spare parts. It was an asymmetrical reconnaissance plane with the cockpit located on the right wing tip and the engine on the left, giving it a completely unbalanced appearance that baffled everyone who saw it. Surprisingly, it actually flew quite well, but the German Air Ministry simply could not get past how weird it looked. They refused to mass-produce it largely because pilots were terrified of flying something that looked like it had already crashed and been glued back together, proving that aesthetics actually do matter in war. 42. The Soviet Amphilomet was a weapon born out of pure desperation that was essentially a giant potato gun designed to launch glass spheres filled with incendiary liquid. The idea was to throw these glass balls at enemy tanks to set them on fire. But the problem was that glass is inherently fragile. If the propellant charge was too strong or the barrel was dirty, the sphere would often shatter inside the tube immediately upon firing, covering the Soviet gun crew in burning liquid. It was a weapon that required nerves of steel to operate, because every trigger pull was a gamble between destroying a German tank or setting yourself and your friends on fire in a trench. 43. The Japanese Type 94. Nambu pistol is often cited as one of the most dangerously flawed service handguns of the war due to a startling design oversight in its firing mechanism. An exposed sear component on the side of the frame could be pressed inadvertently, meaning the weapon could discharge without a conventional trigger pull if handled carelessly or bumped at the wrong angle. For soldiers already operating in chaotic combat environments, this turned a standard sidearm into a constant liability. Reports circulated among Allied troops warning them to exercise extreme caution if they picked one up, because the pistol had a reputation for being mechanically temperamental in ways that made even experienced handlers uneasy. 44. Secrecy is vital in war, but the canal defense light was a secret weapon that turned out to be nothing more than a giant strobe light mounted on a tank. The plan was to use a powerful carbon arc searchlight with a shutter that flickered rapidly to dazzle and disorient enemy troops during night attacks, inducing a sort of artificial vertigo. The British Army guarded this secret so closely that they barely even trained their own troops on how to use it, and when they finally deployed it, the results were underwhelming. It turns out that while a flickering light is annoying, it does not actually stop a German tank from shooting back at the giant glowing target in the dark, making it one of the most overhyped flashlights in history. After all the rocket coffins, floating tanks, and steel monsters that barely moved, one thing becomes clear. Desperation is the most powerful weapons designer in history. Now here's what I want to know. Which insane project did we miss that deserves to be on this list? Drop it in the comments and make your case. If this kind of military absurdity fascinates you, like the video, subscribe, and let's keep exposing history's most expensive mistakes.